enthused with us this morning. We're so glad you are.
Well, greetings everybody. My voice is a little hoarse, so I want to make sure you can all hear me. I am good at talking into microphones. But sitting over there, the air conditioning was, the air was coming down. I don't know if you used to watch Get Smart, the old TV series. And you remember Maxwell Smart would insist with the chief that they had to go into the cone of silence, right? And so I don't want anybody to have that experience here today. Well, greetings. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you. This is actually my 9th AU convention, so I'm beginning to log a few years out here in the racing pigeon world. Thank you, members of the board, for this opportunity. I wish President Rivera was here, but of course we wish him well and hope for a speedy recovery. And also thank you, Karen, for all the assistance you give me throughout the year when we tackle the various challenges that come to the sport. I also like to just do my annual shout out to Gary Braden in the back row, because it's because of Gary that I had the opportunity to serve you in Washington. And it's also a relief to get out of Washington. You know, it hasn't been a pretty sight, and even for guys like me who've become a little cynical and jaded, the last year or two in Washington has been, we've been pretty disgusted, because the very future of the nation, in some ways the world, is at stake, and it's a pawn to politics. Now, this morning I was watching CNN, and all of a sudden they're making great progress. So I guess it takes an election. We should probably hold an election every 3 months, because that would trigger more activity and less campaigning. So let's all hope that they figure that out, or some of the problems we're looking at will pale in comparison. I took a look at my notes from last year as I was flying out here, and my theme last year was celebrating boredom. And that was because when I stood up here last year, I had nothing exciting to relate. You know, in previous years, we had tackled some very big problems. When I was initially hired, it was because the U.S. Department of Agriculture was working on regulations, federal regulations, to regulate your birds and other birds around the country. And, this is a great example of government overkill, that you'd have to be flipping through the Code of Federal Regulations to see if you're feeding your birds, the right vitamin mix. We successfully have beaten that back, and that was an initiative of the animal rights groups. Hard on the heels of that was really dealing with the ramifications of 9/11 and concern about air travel, and the airlines began to refuse to transport your birds as part of the postal system. And we talked then about whether you might even have a constitutional right to access to the postal service, but the airlines were refusing to transport the birds, and we were researching airline transportation policies, because they can only refuse to transport animals if they refuse to transport all animals. We quickly identified that they were refusing your birds, but they weren't refusing exotic fish and a number of other things. But that was a long, engaged time. Karen was in Washington. I think Gary came in at one point, and others. And in the end, the Postal Service switched all of its air transport of mail over to FedEx. And I think we saw a dramatic increase, a dramatic shortening of the time it took to get the birds, which was great for the birds and obviously great for the sport. If that wasn't enough, in all these early exciting years, we had the threat of calamity to the human race. And I'm talking about the H5N1 virus and avian flu, and the question of whether pigeons could transmit avian flu. And of course they travel over great distances, and they mix with wild birds, and then they come back to flocks of domesticated birds, and they stop along the way and snack at chicken farms or whatever they do in transit. And we were very concerned about the hysteria at that time. I remember holding up a magazine cover of one of these boring inside Washington Beltway magazines, and it showed chickens being burned. It was literally an inflammatory cover. And we worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and their folks again to really insist that science decide how your sport be treated rather than hysteria. And we would accept what science said was the best practice, but they too had to accept it as well and not go overboard. In that same period we had the exotic Newcastle disease outbreak in the Southwest and in California, and a lot of chicken flocks were depopulated, was the term they used, and as well as some pigeon ones. And The AU consulted some of the top avian veterinarians in the country and developed, science said you need better bioprotocols. And the AU researched them and promulgated them to the membership, and all of you should make sure you're up to date on those things, because those are important things. But the AU stood by values and science in that discussion. Then, excuse me, I have some water here. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which is the agency we deal with the most, began promulgating the National Animal ID System, and some people were again very worried about a big brother intrusion. Every animal would have to have a separate ID. Well, we rolled in there, and they agreed that the bands you were already using would satisfy any possible future requirement, and so that's a non-issue for the sport as well. Then, of course, we had difficulties with people in other pigeon communities, not the racing pigeon community, violating the Migratory Bird Treaty Act with regard to the treatment of certain birds. And, we sat down, discussed the problems, promulgated some information, and put out there a policy that, if you violate federal law and you're found guilty, the sport will sanction you as well. Responsible conduct at each step in response to each crisis. So we've had some challenging years, and each time the AU and its membership has risen to that challenge. And they've done it by not getting hysterical yourself, but saying, here's what we stand for. We are responsible members of our communities, and we will respond responsibly. So, a year ago, I didn't have any exciting things like this to report. I probably revisited these past efforts, but my whole theme was celebrating boredom, which really is the best presentation I can give. Sadly, that is not today's presentation. As you are all, I'm sure, aware, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, as they are known for short, have brought allegations against the sport, comparing it to cockfighting, which has been banned in many states, and campaigning to not only end the sport, but literally they are making efforts to put people in this room and around the country behind bars. And I will explain that. But that is their goal. There are people in this room they would like to see found guilty of criminal charges and with a potential consequence that they would go to jail or pay a fine or whatever. Now, I'm not expecting that outcome, but that is their goal. So, we know that at the 100th anniversary convention in Oklahoma City, PETA had undercover investigators there because they released a film this past year of their undercover investigation at a number of different events with, low-angle cameras that must have been hidden in bags and so forth, and grainy shots, all highly edited. I looked at it again this morning. How many of you have looked at the video? Okay, it's worth looking at and thinking about. But I was watching it, and this time you always notice something different each time. It's highly edited. They show a hawk at one point eating a pigeon, and they have this problem with the sport that hawks eat your pigeons. And you think, well, yeah, hawks also eat park pigeons. A lot of their things don't quite. I hear what they're saying on some things. A lot of things don't ring true. There's also some editing where a person's cut off almost in the middle of a word, and you wonder what was said before and what was said afterwards. This was a piece designed to generate as much emotional response as possible in opposition to the sport of pigeon racing. And they did it through this undercover investigation. Well, let me assume, we know that earlier this week there were a few people floating around the convention who were unidentified, and some suggestion in an earlier discussion that they may have been PETA folks. PETA has gone to the local police here in advance of this convention. You had police officers here the first night or two just checking things out. They quickly got bored and went home because there's nothing going on that they care about. So let me assume for a moment that perhaps we have a PETA person in this room. We don't all know each other. And let me begin by saying welcome. I'd like to take a few moments now to address, our PETA undercover investigator. We know that there is no way we can convince you that you are wrong about the nature of this sport. But I'm hoping that when you come into this room, or when you visit the various activities throughout the week, or when you go to the races or the lofts, that you recognize that this is a good group of folk. This is a group of good folks. And you know, your organization, PETA, once called hunters the equivalent of, quote, Nazis and slave traders. You know, I hope you don't come to a convention like this and think that this group is somehow the equivalent of Nazis and slave traders. You know, when you go to the AU website, and we know you've been there, you quote our website, and you know, frankly, we look at your website a lot as well. We hope that when you look at that website, you recognize that the website itself, which was not crafted the way your investigative film was crafted, but simply reflects the activities of the organization over the last years, that when you look at the AU website, you also see the values that are embedded there. The programs oriented at families, the various kids programs that were discussed a few minutes ago that are helping kids to learn and to grow and even to go on to university. The involvement with the 4-H and zoos, although I presume that you're opposed to the 4-H and zoos as well. The charity auctions that raise money for community causes. The releases at veterans events honoring those who've served America and those who've died in America's cause. The Lost Bird Program, encouraging members in the community when they find a lost bird to connect it and return it back to its owner. You don't have programs like that if you don't care about your birds. Some of the clubs have pigeon adoption programs. I mentioned a few minutes ago the response to avian flu and the establishment of biosecurity protocols. With that, this organization has something called the Loft Registration Program that they push with their members, and it's all about the highest possible standards of care for pigeons, based on advice from expert veterinarians. So, Mr. PETA Investigator, or Mrs. or Ms. PETA Investigator, when you look at that site, I hope you recognize those values too, and don't edit them out of your mind. If you go on to look at the organic documents of the organization, the AU Constitution and bylaws, there too you will find the values of this organization going back 100 years. The hard work by many outstanding citizens to build a culture of responsible behavior in the care and handling of pigeons and in the conduct of AU races. And just to quote, I hope you bothered to read the bylaws and Constitution, Mr. PETA Investigator. But the AU sanctions members who engage in conduct harmful to pigeons. The AU prohibits and sanctions members who use prohibited substances or who enter into a race of pigeon known to be injured, ill, or suffering from a communicable disease. The AU prohibits a member to knowingly house, or requires a member to house and maintain, well, flip this around, prohibits members from knowingly housing or maintaining any pigeon without providing reasonably adequate shelter, food or water, in order for it to survive without undue hardship or injuries. These are the rules of the organization. With regard to transportation, the AU bylaws sanction members who knowingly fail and refuse to comply with all the rules and regulations of the U.S. Postal Service regarding how you safely transport animals through the postal system. And if you violate those rules, the AU will suspend you for a year for the first offense, and they will suspend you permanently for a second offense. This is not an organization that takes lightly the care of the athletes that it is engaged with, the pigeons. You know, as I continue to roll through and think about the identity of the AU and my own 9-year journey with you, you know, I find it in other places, not just the bylaws, but you have a code of ethics on top of all these other things. And there, you require AU members to provide adequate and sanitary housing for your birds. You have to, again, feed your pigeons an adequate diet and maintain them in healthy physical condition and arrange for proper medical care. You know, I hate to say it, but I think racing pigeons get better medical care than the average American. You know, they are valuable and they are well cared for. You know, there's always a bad apple, I'm sure. But this is not what the sport is about, and yet you claim that this is what it's about. The Code of Ethics talks about things like AU members shall not train their birds in a reckless or ruthless manner that presents undue hardships on the birds or that may affect the loss of pigeons. You know, you emphasize so much that point, but we work so hard to prevent those things. In fact, the welfare, health, and safety of all race birds is to be the first consideration in their transportation, according to the AU Code of Ethics, and no injured or disabled bird is to be shipped. Finally, AU members are not to release birds in training or in races in weather conditions which make orientation or homing excessively difficult, such as in times of heavy fog, rain, snow, hail, strong headwinds, or similar detrimental weather conditions. Now, I'm reading a lot of the provisions of your own documents, but the point I want to make to Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. PETA investigator, undercover investigator, is this is an organization that has taken a lot of time to think about the good of its birds and the good of its memberships, and has put it down in writing and has systems for enforcing it. And finally, I'd like to note from the Code of Ethics that AU members shall make every effort to recover, care for, and find the owner of any found or stray banded bird. You know, if the birds were meaningless, nobody would bother to do that sort of thing. So, the AU seeks to be responsible in the conduct of its sport and in its role within the broader community in which AU members live. When you think about it, pigeons and humans have been interacting in exactly this fashion for thousands of years. And I'm struck, Mr. PETA investigator, when I go to your website at how much you celebrate this on your own website. You talk about pigeons, their long and distinguished service as messengers during war, World War I, World War II, Korean and Vietnam War, their medals for heroism, their participation in CIA aerial photography, their use in banking, their speed and stamina, sighting a pigeon flying from Africa to London, their use in Coast Guard rescue operations. All of this you actually applaud and celebrate on your own website. And this is the exact same activity here. Now I imagine if you're out there, this may come off your website pretty soon. But I am struck by these incongruities in your approach. I'm also struck, Mr. and Mrs. Ms. PETA investigator, by your sudden interest in pigeon racing. It's been around for thousands of years. Your organization has been around for decades. You're a $40 million a year organization. You have 3 million members. You've been totally aware of pigeon racing for decades and decades and never said one word about it until the Discovery Channel ran the Animal Planet program with Mike Tyson, a controversial figure, a little over a year ago. And all of a sudden, in that moment, you care. And it is very hard for me to not look at that with a cynical eye. That this isn't spurred by the opportunism of public relations, rather than a heartfelt feeling with regard to pigeons. Although I don't ultimately doubt the sincerity of your views. We don't agree with them. It's notable to us as well that PETA operates its own animal rescue and adoption facilities, where, as I understand it, PETA has to put a lot of animals to sleep. And I also understand that you do it in a very humane fashion. But you do it because it is the only way you can manage the population of animals under your care. So, cast not the first stone. I'm struck by something else in your campaign, which is your newfound zeal to stop illegal gambling. I never understood PETA to be an anti-gambling organization. I haven't heard you condemn Super Bowl or March Madness pools or poker games at home, a lot of which activities could be deemed illegal. In your undercover investigative film, you state that pigeon racing, there's $15 million a year of illegal activity in pigeon racing. That number appears to include all the legal prize money that's out there, and I don't know how to generate those numbers, but I think you're confusing legitimate prize money. The police were here this week, legitimate activities with what you are labeling illegal gaming. But it's notable to me because that amount of money is about how much is probably bet in 1 hour at the Bellagio in Las Vegas. And yet you try to make it sound as if the earth has moved on this point. And you should know that the AU has a bylaw that sanctions members engaged in illegal activity. The AU does not condone illegal activity. The AU does not condone illegal gaming. But much of the activity that you see and you try to label illegal is not. Of course, we recognize that your zeal is really just a means to an end. You don't really care about the gambling issue. I mean, do you? No, Peter friends, you have been criticized many times for your activities, for publishing lurid comic books titled, "Your Mother is a Terrorist because she serves hamburgers to her kids for dinner." And you are allied with animal rights groups who go one step farther than you. You know, you have a constitutionally protected right to express your views, but you're allied with groups who destroy medical research labs and engage in other violent and destructive acts. And these acts are clearly illegal. I have viewed your investigative film, and you can tell, clicking on YouTube, how many others have viewed it, and the number right now is about 16,000. And at first blush, you know, that sounds like that could be impressive, although it doesn't, even if that entire 16,000 was from your own membership, which is probably not, that's 1/2 of 1% of your entire membership who cared enough to click on your major expose on pigeon racing, at most. I Googled around and found a video that's been on roughly the same time frame about how to race pigeons. And I just want to point out to you that that has been viewed 50,000 times. And pigeon racing is an obscure sport. So I would suggest to you that your message and your story is not resonating, and that there are substantive reasons for why that is so. We recognize that the values of the pigeon racing communities will not satisfy you. You would have us release the birds into the wild, even though wild pigeons and park pigeons have a much worse existence than racing pigeons. And every time we release them, they fly back. So that doesn't work so well. You can harass the sport, but ultimately it is not within your power to bring it to an end. Just as you have not been able to shut down McDonald's, or horse racing, or dog racing, or zoos, or circuses, or pet stores, you will not be able to shut down pigeon racing. That power does not reside within your reach. The survival of the sport depends rather not on you, but on the other people in this room, the members of the AU, the other fanciers around the country who love pigeon racing, who may be from families who've engaged in it for generations, the good folk I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. You know, you've just heard a recitation of the values of this community. As long as this community stays true to these values, and I hear them talk about it every day when I'm at these conventions, your ideas and beliefs will not carry the day. At the end of the day, their story is better than your story. The sport is thriving, or it's entering a period of regeneration, as was indicated by the 891, roughly, new members this past year. That's quite a jump. The Economist, which is one of these boring, important magazines read by the self-satisfied elite in Washington, ran an article it's actually October 27th, so just a few weeks ago, about racing pigeons and how much they're going for. And I have to convert from euros. I had to look it up on my phone this morning. The conversion from €1 is equal to $1.27. And you know, the prices are skyrocketing for sales of pigeons from Belgium to China. They're looking at selling birds up into the €250,000 range, which is well over $300,000. Birds from China are not sold back into Belgium because of fears of avian flu. The sport, again, being responsible. And this is not an indication of a sport that's in decline or of a world that is willing to abandon a relationship between an animal and humans that has been in place for millennia and will likely be in place for millennia into the future. So if Mr., Mrs., Ms. PETA investigators here, you know, these are our thoughts back to you. And we respect your constitutional rights, but when you do a film about this sport, be fair. And then we'll let the world decide who has the better story. So those are my thoughts to our undercover operatives if they're here today. This is an interesting year, not a boring year for us. You know, of great concern, I mentioned at the beginning, is that PETA seeks to put people behind bars in this room. And that is because they have made these wild allegations about illegal gambling. And they have promoted them with a number of different prosecutors in different jurisdictions around the country. I can tell you, and I hate to reveal this to you, Mr., Ms., and Mrs. Undercover PETA investigator, that the prosecutors roll their eyes at your allegations and your accusations. But still, we know if you push in enough places and you push enough buttons, somebody along the way will react and respond, and we will respond to them with our story and our tale. And this organization and this sport will always adapt, as it has done to all the other threats I've mentioned, responsibly, with sound science, and march into a better and more stable future. And in the end, PETA, perhaps you will be helpful to us, because you will not scare these guys. These guys scare me sometimes. You know, this is a tough crew in some ways. You're not tougher than pigeon flyers. But I can tell you, pigeon flyers, I think, are more committed to looking at things fairly and straight on. So I offer those thoughts. You know, I'm around this morning and happy to talk in more detail about issues you face locally. I think we were pleased that there weren't any protests this week here. I think that goes to the point that even within the PETA community, this is not a burning issue, except for a few people who thought they'd ride a wave. And that wave was an Animal Planet TV show a couple years ago. And I can't wave them on and say PETA will magically go away. They won't. You know, once something's on the web, it never disappears now. But I can assure you that as long as you stay true to your values, they will not prevail. I'm switching topics now, but the other little issue of interest we had in the last few months was the discovery that counterfeit AU bands were being sold on the web. And if any of you got a really good deal on an AU band, you better take a look at it and make sure it actually came from the AU, who has not yet shipped 2013 bands. Is that right? So if you bought 2013 AU bands in the last few months, they're not going to work. And you won't be able to use them to compete in AU-sponsored events. We, in fact, these were being sold anonymously on the web. We tracked down, as best we could, all the different sites where they were for sale and identified one where we could email back the person. We didn't know the person's name. I think that we did that through the eBay site. And I wrote a big, long cease and desist letter, as lawyers like to do, but the email messaging wouldn't take more than 1,000 characters. And my letter was about 3,000. So I said, all right, I got to just cut to the chase. I almost just said cease and desist. But I shortened it down to fit within the 1,000 character restriction. And I have to say, to the credit of the anonymous person on the other end of the line, an hour later they called back, profusely apologetic. Not called back, emailed back. And they gave me the link to the site where they purchased the counterfeit AU bands. And let me say, you know, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So there's actually a company out there trying to imitate your bands. Now they have metal lining, and your bands don't. So it's pretty easy to tell them apart. But we found the site. I clicked and went to the site. But I have to admit I was stymied because the entire site was in Chinese. And if any of you can read or speak Chinese or know someone who can, we need your help deciphering this site. And then we'll send a message over there. But I'm not sure the long arm of the AU can necessarily reach to China. But to the extent that China has its own racing pigeon union, and you're developing global relations and people are selling pigeons to Chinese billionaires for $300,000, you might be able, through the sort of informal court of the racing pigeon opinions, to talk to those communities in China and say, hey, you have people in your country who are seeking to take advantage of our sport and our members. So I'm hopeful that problem is not too severe, and that all of you are waiting for the the 2013 bans, which will be coming out soon. But this has indeed been an interesting year. So I certainly can take any questions or step down or address other issues.